Welcome to 3 Minutes of History. I'm your future history teacher, Chris Oxenford, and let's get started.
April 9th, 1865. Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Having run short of supplies and facing increasingly heavy Union attacks, Confederate General Robert E. Lee meets with Union Commander Ulysses S. Grant at the home of Wilmer McLean. The two men agreed to the terms for the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia and any other forces under Lee's command. A few weeks later, on April 26th, a few hundred miles to the south, at Bennett Place, North Carolina, Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston, commanding the Army of Tennessee, met with William Tecumseh Sherman. They had attempted to conclude the surrender terms for the entire Confederacy, but Sherman's superiors had informed him that this exceeded his authority. Johnston nevertheless surrendered 82,000 Confederate soldiers in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Florida to General Sherman, the largest surrender of the Civil War. A few days later, on May 4th, General Richard E. Taylor, commanding Confederate forces in Alabama, met with General E.R.S. Canby, commanding Union forces at Citronella, Alabama, north of Mobile. Taylor was the son of former President and Army officer Zachary Taylor and had led Confederate troops through much of the Civil War. With the surrender of his command on May 4th, nearly a month after Appomattox, there were no major Confederate armies left east of the Mississippi River. On May 10, 1865, fugitive Confederate President Jefferson Davis was captured by Union cavalry near Irwinville, Georgia. It was unclear exactly where Davis was trying to go, either into the West to continue the war, or into Florida to escape abroad. But in either case, his capture ended that hope and the existence of the Confederate government. West of the Mississippi River, the situation was somewhat different. Since the fall of Vicksburg on July 4, 1863, the states of Arkansas, Texas, and Louisiana had been virtually cut off from the Confederate government in Richmond. The area, called the Trans-Mississippi Department, was commanded by General Edmund Kirby Smith. Born in Florida, Smith had distinguished himself in both the Mexican War and during the Civil War, rising rapidly to the rank of lieutenant general and command of the Trans-Mississippi Department. The Union commander in Texas, the future author of Ben-Hur, General Lew Wallace, attempted in May to negotiate the surrender of Kirby Smith's command. He met with two officers based in Texas, James Slaughter and John Ford, and offered them generous terms. Slaughter and Ford sent these terms to Smith and were promptly rejected. Smith also notified governors on May 9th that despite the surrenders of Lee, Johnston, and Taylor, he intended to fight on. Around this same time, the commander of Union forces in the area dispatched 250 United States colored troops and 50 cavalry to capture Brownsville and the Confederate forces in the area. On May 11th, this force landed near Brownsville and advanced on the Confederate camp at White's Ranch. This force marched through the night on May 11th and arrived at White's Ranch at daybreak on the 12th. The Army camped at White's Ranch and tried to remain out of sight of any Confederates in the area, but were spotted by Mexican civilians, who were probably actually Confederate officers. Now aware that they had lost the element of surprise, the Union Army resumed its advance towards Brownsville. This force encountered Confederate troops at Palmito Ranch on the afternoon of April 12th. After a brief skirmish, they withdrew back to White's Ranch to get additional reinforcements. The next morning, May 13th, Colonel Barrett arrived with enough soldiers to bring the attacking force up to 500 men, and they advanced again on Palmito Ranch. They managed to drive back the Confederate troops of about 190 men, before, at 3 p.m., the Confederates were reinforced by John Ford with cavalry and artillery. This force drove back the advancing Union troops. Only by deploying successive skirmish lines were the Union troops able to withdraw back to their base. About 111 men were captured, 30 men were killed and wounded, and among those killed was Private John J. Williams of the 34th Indiana Infantry. Williams is one of the two soldiers who were claimed to be the last casualties of the Civil War. About a month after the battle, Kirby Smith would surrender the remaining Confederate forces on June 2, 1865. The last remaining organized Confederate force surrendered on June 23rd in Oklahoma, bringing about the final end of the Civil War.
This has been 3 Minutes of History. I'm Chris Oxenford. Thank you for joining me.